Everyone to the call. It's a session on working day one reporting. As usual, I think I'll probably need to say about housekeeping and technology. So we're at the mercy of Teams, and hopefully it will keep working. At some point, I'm going to share my screen, so we'll have to bear with me on at that point. And then just in terms of structure of the session. I know many people will be familiar with working day one reporting or have some exposure to it over the course of the recent years. Certainly a subject I came across 7 years ago when it was first discussed as a potential in Portsmouth. But I guess we'll have a breadth of understanding about the subject. But I was going to just go back to, in simple terms, what is it? What are the potential benefits? What our approach has been, our experience, if you like. And some of the challenges we've faced, and wouldn't by no means consider ourselves experts on the subject, but I think you'll find there's some interesting stuff sort of packed in there. And then just as in terms of structure, I'll go through a short presentation. I was going to go through a short presentation, and then there'll be questions and an opportunity to ask questions at the end. But if you're welcome to raise your hand, and Megan will. Bring it to my attention or something if that's a better way of doing it, or if you want to put something in the chat box, obviously please do. Now, in terms of structure, I was going to ask. Our CFO is here, so I was going to perhaps I thought the best way of dealing with this was to get his perspective on things straight off, get him involved, and get his take on the benefits of working day one reporting. And then he can say, why now? What was this? Why was this a good time for Portsmouth? And give a bit of context from an executive point of view, and then perhaps I'll cover off anything he doesn't mention, and look at it from a finance team point of view and say, what is it meant for us? So I hope that's okay, Mark. If you're comfortable coming in at that point.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thanks for that, and I do regard you as being an expert, by the way. I know you hide your light under a bushel, as they say, but yeah, you are definitely a day one expert, and that's the reason you're on this. So hello everyone, my name is Mark Orchard, Chief Financial Officer here at Portsmouth Hospitals, as well as Steve. We've also got Joe Gooch, Finance Director, on as well. So between the three of us, I think we'll probably field anything, Steve, won't we, at the end? But I know Steve's going to take the lion's share of the sort of presentation and so on. Yeah, Steve's asked me just to give a bit of context from an exec perspective before we sort of dive into how we did it and where we are and all the detail. I suppose I'd probably just start by saying we as a trust have a history, not a recent history, thankfully, but we have a history of being quite financially challenged. So you've only got to step back as far as 2018-19, and this organisation had in that year an unplanned deficit of just under £38 million. So a very significant sort of deficit, and that was off the back of many years of deficits, and being seen as being I think it's fair to say, Steve, being seen to be a sort of financially challenged organisation for all sorts of reasons that Steve may or may not go into his background, but we're one of the largest PFI sites here, and there's all sorts of issues in the background there. So that's kind of part of our journey. We committed to, as a finance function, probably a couple of years ago now, maybe, and then we developed it in anger probably over the last 18 months or so, what we call our financial strategy for improvement. So it's not just a long-term financial model that gets us kind of to a more positive position financially at the end of a period of time, but we've committed to, at this trust, under Joe's leadership, with the finance team, with Steve and others within the finance team, we've committed to something called a financial strategy for improvement, which has a number of ambitions in there, which are some about delivering the bottom line numbers, but it's not like a medium-term financial strategy or whatever in the technical sense of the word. It's a vision and a set of things that we want to set out to do to move the financial awareness and ownership of the financial position across the whole organisation. So we got a bunch of stuffs in there. Day one is a big key plank within our financial strategy for improvement, which is what we're talking about today. But there are other things in there that sit alongside this. For example, simplifying information, making information that goes out from finance team much more easy to understand, easier to empower individuals, easy for individuals that are holding budgets and spending the money to take the actions on. And there's a whole bunch of things in there that we could, if we had time, we'd probably describe in a more broader sense. But I just want to position that because day one sits within a number of other things, therefore. And day one was about really following the lead from Bolton, Leeds, Manchester and other areas that have done day one, is following the lead in order to give us the maximum amount of influenceable time in the month to influence the next month's numbers before we then report on the next month's numbers, if that makes sense. So before day one, I think we had a day 5 and a day 6 process running, and therefore I think we didn't probably share any detailed budget performance information on the previous months till at least the end of day 6, probably day 7 by the time we concluded. We're now in a position where since April we're sharing information. Joe sends an email out to the trust leadership team, and there's a series of cascades across budget managers which starts at about 5 o'clock at the end of the first of the month. So that's where we are, and that's where we've been, and Steve will come on to describe that in a minute. I can't tell you how powerful it is right, to sit in a trust leadership team meeting, which is our exec team and our 4 divisional directors, on the second working day of the month at 8:30 in the morning, the second of whatever month, and to be talking about the final position on last month, position that's just concluded the day before. I can't tell you how empowering that is to the organisation to know exactly what the headline actions are, what they need to take, and then to give ourselves, best part of 30 days to have actions to take forward to influence the next set of results. And we've realigned our executive sort of trust leadership team monthly cycle in line with this as well, to recognise the fact that we're now going to get that information on the the first working day of the month, but we can talk about it as a collective group on the second working day, potentially at 8:30. I say I can't tell you how powerful that is. Whereas previously, Steve, and Joe, we might have been taking information to the executive team by the time it all got out and then into board cycles and stuff. It might have been the third working week of the month before we were talking about the same thing. So just want to say how powerful that has been. We've done that since April. I'm going to say sustainable, but Steve will tell you all the challenges in sustaining it. Anyway, that's kind of where we are. There's so much more I could say, Steve, actually, but I tell you what, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand back to you to go through. Hopefully I've whet the appetite a bit, but I'm going to hand back to you for the detail. Joe and I will come in and support any questions or anything from a sort of user feel or exec feel as we go along. So Steve, is that okay?
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Mark. You've covered some of the bits. I'll go back over 1 or 2 of those bits, but yeah, you've covered them really well. Thank you. This is my presentation. I'm just going to share the screen. Hopefully you can see that. I'm just going to go back a little tiny bit and just do a little bit of context on Portsmouth and who we are in terms of sort of scale and what have you. We were a third wave trust that goes all the way back to 93, if you recall. I hope some of you might recall. And we actually acquired university status in 2020. It's difficult to judge how in terms of size. I think we're certainly a medium-sized trust, by most measures. 1,200 beds. We've got about 30 theatres, 700 million pound turnover and 8,000 staff, and growing systematically year to year. As an organisation, it's consistently larger, and we can track that back over a very long period of time. Organised like many trusts into sizable clinical divisions with a corporate and commercial sort of wing. And as Mark said, we have a significant PFI arrangement here at the hospital. Like many sites, was aging, and then effectively half the hospital was rebuilt and commissioned in 2009, and we've got a 35-year PFI contract orientated around the sort of purchase of that part of the development and FM services. And there's been many trusts that have similar arrangements. And then we're a renal specialist service for the South Coast. And we have a large pharmacy distribution hub here, which just simply means we sort of buy and sell and pass on sort of drug purchases to many other hospitals on the South Coast. Okay, a little bit about the finance team, about 60 staff in the finance team, not all sort of pure finance accountants in those terms. You know, we have a mixture of sort of technical experts, systems experts, overseas team as well, but covering certainly the sort of familiar aspects of finance teams in many ways. Perhaps what's different to many trusts, but certainly be common with many as well, is that we have a contracted out accounts payable, accounts receivable, payroll service. Have done for many years. As you see, it's 15 years in now on the contract. And that includes our ledger. And I'm going to come on to that in a little bit more detail because it's significant in terms of how we manage the balance of our transactions. Because effectively, you can see for a contract that's 15 years old, but has been renewed throughout that period, we have predetermined set parameters for how things are delivered, for whether it's for payroll or accounts payable. Goods received, not invoiced, and when they're playing into the system, and it influences the way a close down works. But we'll go on to see that we have become, you know, accustomed to being able to manage it effectively in terms of our day one process. And then, as Mark alluded to, working day one reporting. Effectively, we used to report on working days 6 to 11. So our in sort of there's some of our reporting still occurs after working day one, effectively, you know, where we're responding to other organisations, something like the ICS or NHS England. But effectively, our core messages go out to budget holders on working day one, and have done for the last 6 months. Probably won't go through all of this slide, but this effectively is like the recognised benefits of day one reporting. Mark did a really good job of explaining these in terms of like getting information to budget holders as fast as possible, sharing key messages, avoiding delays in response times from a point of view of what the organisation needs. All really sort of potent sort of stuff. And so this is like the sort of straight out of the textbook type stuff that is the benefits of working day one reporting. Less to do with how the finance department functions, probably more to do with how what you get from it and what you could expect to achieve as an organisation. Probably the third point here about procedures is really key, because we found that it was certainly true that while we thought we knew everything about close down, and we could certainly run a close down process really effectively, by going to day one reporting, we went through everything from scratch and effectively redesigned our own understanding of working day one reporting of financial close down, and it does test whether you really know as much as you thought you did. Reinvesting the time gained, this is really key, I think, obviously. So it effectively puts us at least a week ahead. It probably puts us 2 weeks ahead of where we used to be. And while I think it's still early days to say whether we're making the most of that time, but I think we're able to now explore a bigger range of issues than we probably would comfortably now to cover before, by effectively feeling like we're getting ahead of the game. And we're using some of that time to address some of the issues within the financial strategy for improvement, as Mark mentioned, which includes, you know, the developing budget holders' awareness and their understanding, and effectively, you know, making the organisation more financially aware. In terms of intangible benefits, this is much more subjective. So I guess these are sort of just things that I probably came to mind from my own perspective. Certainly, I think it's invigorated the sort of confidence in our own financial capabilities. I'm going to come on to that a little bit more later on, and it's probably sort of pushed the finance department back to the sort of top of the corporate services list, if you like, in terms of like we are always at the forefront of saying this is the answer for the latest month, and others sometimes can be weeks and weeks behind where we're at, which is really it's good from our perspective. I mean that we're leading the way. It shows a bit of passion and a bit of ambition. Certainly took us out of our comfort zone. And I'm going to come on to that a little bit more because I think that's the key to all this. And it definitely it does build a platform for more success, because basically there's much more of a feeling that we can probably confront any complex issue now and really give a good account of ourselves. So this is just how fundamentally this is still principles about how would it change the way we work. So we've got just going to go back to my presentation. Sorry. Yeah, we effectively moved our core reporting from working day 6. So that's all the sessions we would have with the CFO and the Director of Finance, taken through the financial position, to working day 1. Effectively, it means moving the core processing by 4 days. In essence, that's right. There's going to be a little bit of variation on that, but effectively, it doesn't mean you go faster. It just means everything just slips sideways by 4 days. That's been our experience so far. Now, some things will fall out of that, because when you go through the timetable and you look at some of the things you might have otherwise done, you will find things that are unnecessary or perhaps less value added. And so we definitely culled elements of some of our processing because it was proven to be unnecessary, but effectively we're working on a sort of not going faster necessarily, but we're shifting the processing element of close down by 4 days. So this is really key. The third point really is really key in terms of the process end to end. So within those 4 days, effectively on day -1, the system generated element, this is the consequence of having an outsourced ledger and outsourced financial services, is that the system generated transactions are effectively sequenced to come in either at the end of a calendar period or on specific working days. So the last working day of each month, the system generated accruals to do with goods received not invoiced and registered invoices not paid will flow into the ledger on the evening of working day -1. Now that probably sounds horrific, because for us that's about £10 million worth of transactions at least. But we handle it. We handle it by effectively tracking it through reports to anticipate what the effect's going to be. I might come on to that a little bit further on, I think. Now the fourth point on this list is probably the hardest pill to swallow, effectively, to do with working day 1 from our perspective, is that when you look at compared to how we work now compared to how we used to work, we would have had 4 days of processing and probably 2 days of validation. Well, we've still got 4 days of processing, but now we've got a day of validation at the most. It may even be less than that. Effectively, all our journals have to be posted by working day -1. Other than the system generated elements, which we try and track and anticipate what their financial value will be, and do that quite successfully. But effectively, our interpretation time and our fine tuning is cut to very tight times. You're probably talking about 2 or 3 hours on working day 1 morning to be able to make any fine tuning. So it does rely upon the processing element of working day 1 really being effective days -2, -1, when and the effectiveness of your sort of your assessment of the transactions that have gone through at that point in time. This is just the way the day 1 works. Effectively, we're saying, let's go back, jump to slide. Yeah, so on day 1 itself, we can post, as I was just saying about final validation, we can post journals up to about 10 AM, maybe a little later. But effectively at that point we have to stop and start preparing reports for the afternoon session, and that's covering expenditure, capital, and cash. So there's a lot to pack in terms of getting a report together within about 2 hours, and so it's all done in a very structured way. But what's really important is that we get that report done by 1 p.m. so we're ready. We have a quick look through, get an understanding ourselves of what our assessment of the story is. Although to be honest, we've already been doing that since day -1, and then we review with the senior team at 2:30. Publish the budget statements at 5, along with associated reports to divisions and trust leadership team, and that's all what Mark covered earlier. So that's the structure of how it works. But what I wanted to go back and reflect upon is within that, what does it really mean? So as I've probably covered, I think that the process isn't shorter. Not in terms of the processing element. That's still effectively 4 days. It's the interpretation time that is shorter. So, that's probably the thing you have to really come to terms with an outsourced ledger, is that you can't. And if you're committed. Because if you're committed to going out on day 1 and the outsourced ledger effectively triggers transactions that are processed all the way up to the final hours, if you like, before your reports are published, your interpretation time is the single thing that gives the most. And another point on here, I think, is the level of estimates that we use, because I think at the moment, when we first entered into this endeavour, I felt we would be using a vast array of estimates, and we're not. We're actually using relatively tiny levels of estimates to underpin our position. And actually, when I look back to the way we functioned before day 1 reporting, there will always be an element of estimates used in any case. That the curtailment of the time in terms of the sort of constraints of validation doesn't really make it any harder for us, and doesn't encourage a vast array of estimates to be used. And I've covered the point about not all reporting is actually done on day 1, and then there's a high degree of buy-in from the team. That's certainly true. I'm going to come on to that on the next slide, I think. And the team really does need to have a good appreciation of the close down timetable, far more than they would have done before. I know I can speak for myself. I can't always speak for everyone else, but I know that I would have been functioning on the basis of that I instinctively understood what the close down timetable represented prior to working day 1 reporting. But I think this forces the issue, because you do need to be able to understand the timing of things. Also, not even beyond the way in which the close down process works, you need to be able to think about the next month and the months beyond, about where the complications could be. I think in a way in which probably you could have got away with not knowing before day 1 reporting. And then there's just a note at the bottom about that there's an option on you probably wouldn't want to run day 1 reporting on month 9 and month 12 for obvious reasons about sort of complications of timing and the availability of the team. Okay, this is the slide about the outsourced ledger in a little bit more detail, because when we entered into this process, and I think I've heard this from other organisations, the rationale as to why they wouldn't entertain doing day 1 reporting is that they can't control their transactions well enough. And I was of the same mind for sure when we first started talking about this in January of this year, and I've switched around steadily throughout that process, because basically we have adapted to not having any concerns about how the outsourced ledger functions, other than we've got to be aware of what it means. We know that it might vary month to month about whether a file might come in on day -1 or day 1 or 2, but we as long as we can anticipate those things, we can either work with it and make sure that it arrives at the time we expect, or in the case of where it comes in after day 1, we post an estimate, and that would be true of certain things such as supplementary pay files or weekly pay files where they come in after. So they're scheduled to come in after, or after day 1, or effectively very late or very close to day 1. So we would choose to post them then on day 2 and cancel our estimate. We've effectively. So it would have, for some, I think they think it's a showstopper. It hasn't proven to be the case at all. It's just about adapting. So you can see from this, transactions are scheduled and managed through a contract set up well before day 1 ever existed, and they continue to function in that same way. We have not attempted to influence the way in which they function. We are working around it. And it involves a ledger soft close in terms of the last working day of each month for things like goods received not invoiced, or supply chain interface files, or invoices received where there's no PO. And again, they all scheduled to occur in a certain way. And that's the sort of soft close element on the last working day, and then the ledger stays open all the way up to day 7. Effectively, we've drawn stumps by then. We've effectively reported our position. Now, sometimes the ledger's active, and some of those transactions will hit, and we cancel our estimate. And that's probably half the number of months that have gone by this year. There's been something like that. The other half of the months, there are no transactions that occur between day 2 and day 7. The ledger is simply open, and we're just keeping an eye on it to make sure that there's no transactions that we're not aware of that would occur. So I think that's it. That's the concerns around it, but they're not concerns that really troubled us, not so far. To say we're working with it rather than against it or trying to influence it, because it's not something we can necessarily control. In any case, we just have to try and manage the risk. And the last point on here, of course, there is a risk about system availability. I suppose that's true of any system, whether it's a reporting package or not. But effectively, we live with that risk. And okay, well, what would be the worst that could happen? Okay, you wouldn't report on day 1, you might report on day 2 or 3, but it wouldn't necessarily wouldn't damage the sort of credibility of what you're trying to achieve. Okay, and then how did we do it effectively? Now, I had these points in all sorts of orders originally, but I think the top point, getting the team in the right mindset, is the real key here, because when I go back to this was part of our financial strategy for improvement, so it's a significant item to get behind, and this was in January of this year. Not everyone was very keen to go down this road. I think that would be true of many finance teams, is that the buy-in for people to be able to recognise what the benefits are to the finance team is much less clear at the point at which you're sort of contemplating it. And almost you have to sort of go through the process of assessing what it could mean to really get to the bottom of that. Whereas, so I was in exactly the same place. I certainly was interested, but I had some reservations about whether it was going to work, or whether we were going to come up against some of these the outsourcing issues, or or some other complications. Some of it is to do with, I think, the finance team. We'd spent many years sort of effectively sort of processing our close downs effectively, like a well-oiled machine, you could say. You know, effectively, like month in, month out, we would produce our numbers, we would deal with issues, we would, you know, produce our reports and hit all our deadlines. And this sort of that it leaves that question about, if it's not broke, why are you trying to fix it? Well, we're not trying to fix it from a finance team point of view. We're trying to make it better for the organisation, and I think that was a bit of a hard sell within the finance team initially. However, really importantly is that once they started to break it down, which is the second point on this list, is that we broke the challenge up into different financial, you know, aspects of the business. The teams really got behind the idea and started to consider really what was necessary. So they looked at the procedures, and we asked them a questions that simply say, what, forget whether you like it or not at the moment initially, is what would it take to process all the transactions by day -2, you know, and just tell us what would it take. And people started to do that, and consider what they might need from others and whether an estimate was necessary or not. But more and more as we went through that process, they started to get to the point of saying, actually, no, we can do this. To be honest, I think this can be done. And in a way, you have to believe and sort of get behind it and give it a go. But actually, repeatedly, the answer came back. Actually, that was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. No, we can't be complacent because there's always risks. But virtually in every month this year, we have handled the process quickly and effectively, and rarely been troubled for long, other than, you know, recognizing that our interpretation time is cut compared to where we used to be. As a final point about managing any post day one reporting transactions, making sure they're on. So that's simply about the scheduled transactions going through, on pay or non-pay, that effectively are to do with the way the outsourced contract functions, and we just need to be mindful of those things and then cancel them against our estimate, so we don't so we maintain the sort of integrity of the financial position compared to what we said at day one. That's just a table on sort of emphasizing how things have moved, and there's going to be a lot of just some things don't change. So for instance, we still do our forecasting effectively a month in arrears, so we still cut at day -5. That's before or after day one. Similarly, monthly pay processing typically is handled day -3, can be day -2, can vary month to month, but effectively that comes back to just being aware of it, keeping an eye on it. And then commissioning income, that's moved by 4 days, effectively does require certain aspects of our assessments and processes to be adapted so that we effectively monitor activity throughout the month, or our drug costs throughout the month, but effectively we have to cut the data and use an estimate slightly earlier than we used to. If you take, for instance, drug costs, we have to use an estimate that's at day -4 and then monitor it through to the following months to actually pick up on any changes that have occurred. So effectively, most of this list is moving by 4 days until you get all the way down to the reporting phases, and then you're suddenly seeing how stark they've changed. You know, our review date is day -1, or we assess the progress of everything. That would have been on day 4. The draft financial position was suddenly, you know, we're day 1 compared to day 5. Review with the CFO, we're on day 1 compared to day 6. Publish a budget statement as day 1 compared to day 7. You know, it's messages to trust leadership team day 1 compared to day 9, and then we start to push out a little bit, and the board report's done in 4 days, day 4 rather than day 10. So it just shows you how stark it is, and this is how we break our sort of processes down effectively. So we, for the team, when they approach the next month's close down, they have a mid-month reflect and adjust session. They consider what the issues were from last month and what the issues will be for the next month. That's typically working day -10. It can vary a little bit. And then you have a processing phase, review the draft phase, publish, post day 1 reporting between days 2 to 7. Okay. I'll quickly touch on commissioning income and pay. So this is just it's probably just for clarification, like effectively how we have about £50 million worth of clinical income each month, split between fixed and variable contracts. The variable elements at the moment, they have been throughout sort of focused on drugs and devices, but there's also obviously some aspects of activity that are variable and assessed on the basis of what the performance position is. We track activity, it's 3 days out of 5 throughout the month, but effectively we have to cut. For the close down process, we have to take for drugs day -4, a cut of the detail, and then we just track it continually to see what it's starting to look like, and see just in case we have to make a final adjustment to it after day -4. But typically we're accurate enough month to month to be able to sweep up any loose ends into the following month's reporting. Obviously we track our income in terms of our receipts and our debtors and any new investments or issues that are arising, and we take account of the previous month's monitoring process and what it means in terms of a change in the nature of what we reported. Effectively, and the last point is really key, is that it's a complicated area, but our core processes effectively have remained the same. We haven't had to adapt to changing the sort of scheduling of our reporting. We've kept it the same. We just need to be aware of the landscape around us and make sure that we're able to respond where it's needed. And then in terms of pay, not something to be worried about. Most of the core pay charges go through a day -2, and the weekly feeders go through systematically. Our accruals are all run to the last working day of the month, either by they might come in a little earlier, but we judge whether an estimate is necessary to enhance the nature of the accrual on our temporary workforce costs. But I think it's key that, again, this would have been an area where we would have been worried before we'd actually got into doing the process, is that the use of estimates is typically less than 1% of our total pay costs each month, which is far lower than we ever would have imagined. And then we've covered the aspects of the business that sometimes spill over into the working days 2 to 4 on pay. That's just nearly at the end. So this is just from a finance team point of view. This is just a variation of the benefits we covered on one of the first slides, which is around what does the organisation get from this, and this is a little bit of some of the feedback we got from the team, sort of captured in a slightly different way, because from a pure sort of finance point of view, thinking of it a little selfishly, did it make our lives easier or hard or not, or was it harder than we thought? Well, it was hard. It was hard in the first few months because of your nervousness about whether it's going to work. But actually, our reflections now is that the whole thing has been far easier than we ever thought it was going to be. And we have worked really cohesively across the teams to overcome issues quickly and effectively so far. You know, again, it wouldn't be too complacent, but where there's been a challenge, we've pulled together and worked effectively, and I think that's it's drawn us closer together. And third point, again, I'd say this is for me, it's really key, and I think I would hope it's true of everyone, is that we might have thought we understood how things work, but I think this forces you back down the road of are you sure you know, and you have to regroup around your sort of the mechanisms that really make the finance team tick, and what the key inputs to a financial close down process. And we certainly review and simplify our close down timetable systematically now, whereas I think before it would have stagnated a little bit, and I wonder whether anyone was really looking at it that closely. You know, but now we have to be on top of it, and actually it has to work for us. And then I think this is pretty much my final slide, is about risks. But I think some of these risks are perpetual. It doesn't matter whether you report on day 6 or day 1 or somewhere in between, I think. But I think there's a sharper aspect of risk around certain things. So certainly in terms of people, you know, if they're on leave, or if they're unwell, or if they're not available, you know, does it actually constrain you even further? Well, potentially it could, but you have to it basically forces you to consider what the plan is to be able to address that. Again, it's about sort of planning and preparation for these things. And in processing terms, yeah, there's always a risk around the availability of information, and validation windows are tight. So that could hurt us a little if something is delayed, whereas previously it might not have done. But again, I would reflect upon how much damage is really going to be done here, because like if we report on day 2 rather than day 1, you know, that month, then so be it. It hasn't happened so far, but you know, I don't think it would be a terrible occurrence, because we're still of the right frame of mind to go after what we're trying to achieve. And the same with products and systems. You know, if they're down, we can't avoid that. But there was a delay in 1 month when we couldn't quite get the system to work in the way we wanted. So the budget statements went out a little later. But again, you say, well, you know, that's life, and those things happen. But it doesn't stop the principle about whether this was the right thing to do. I'm gonna pause there, if that's okay. So is there, I don't know if there's been any questions, or
there's a couple in the chat. So the first one is, are your AR transactions managed in the same way as your AP ones, as you've described, and come over as part of the WD1 file?
Yeah, everything effectively is scheduled in terms of how the contract specification, how it has always been delivered. We've not attempted to influence any of that, or feel that we would have any right to do so. So everything is effectively scheduled for either a predetermined date. So that might be, say, our supply chain files come in. They run Monday to Sunday, and they come in on effectively on a Sunday night or Monday morning early. There's no influence we got over that. We have to just adapt to an estimate to be able to handle the detail. And the same with the soft close of our FM contract. Effectively runs to the last working day of each month. So again, we just anticipate that detail and try and track it at day -1.
Thank you. We have another question that said, did you say you forecast a month in arrears? Do budget holders get a forecast on what they are sent at week day 1? And is this based on a previous month?
Yeah, that's a good question. But we effectively we forecast a month in arrears. Yeah, so when we publish on day one, they're looking at the forecast of the sort of consolidated changes to the forecast that have happened in the latest month, but the effectively layered into the month 5. So in this case, if we take month 6, they would have the month 5 actuals, the amendments to the forecasts that have been processed during September. And that would be effectively their answer that they would see published on working day 1. You wouldn't try and subsume the month 6 transactions into that forecast outturn as well on day 1. It would be too tight for time.
We just had another one come in saying, do you have many manual accruals and cost transfers, or did you cut this down severely as part of the move to day 1 reporting?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we did cut it down, and we do have quite a few manual adjustments. So the management accounts team have to effectively assess all those transactions and process them, and they typically leave it as late as they can. They can't really leave it any later than day -2. So they have to be on top of their accruals and be tracking them as best they can. There are a lot, you know. Where it can get a clash is that what we found in the first few months, and again this links back to the outsourced ledger, is the you process an accrual for you say a maintenance contract, and then it gets receipted on the last day of a working month. So you've got duplicate transactions. Now we tripped up on that a little in the first couple of months, but we track them really carefully, and we are looking for those duplications. And there is a window, as we said, there's a small window on working day 1 itself where you can say we missed it, and we would be able to post the journal on day 1 before mid-morning to be able to correct it. In the last couple of months, we haven't had any. So our tracking of the receipting of orders compared to our accruals is significantly effective. You know, you couldn't ever rule it out, but it's working.
Thanks, Steve. We've got a couple more coming in now. So one is, how long did it take you to review and work through all of your processes with the team and move to working day 1 from your previous processes? Yeah,
so we not very long, really. I mean, we started to look at the move in January in detail, and then our first working day 1 was April. So we probably had 8 weeks. By month 12, we were already experimenting with going faster, or that we'd already adapted some of our processes to sort of introduce them softly in the background. It's more not to mislead anyone, just to see if they would work. So we effectively, were experimenting with things as we went along, and that worked really well. But I definitely wouldn't underestimate the importance of getting the buy-in of the team, because there will, and I would be a skeptic. I would put myself down as a skeptic to start off with, but it's almost like you have to almost challenge yourself, I think, to say, don't just sit in your comfort zone. Give it a go, and I think you'd probably be surprised at what's possible.
Thank you. And we've got one last one that says, does the final ledger position at hard close change to what was sent to budget holders? Just thinking you mentioned reporting for board, NHEI is done after working day 1, so maybe subject to change.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So at trust level terms, the use of the estimates gives us the flexibility to be able to control the position. So that say we process a supplementary pay file on working day 3. Now at a trust level, that might be £100,000 or something like that. So our estimate would be able to soak that up, and effectively. So we process the true transaction that's gone through, because we can't stop it, and we cancel our estimate. Now it works at a trust level. When you go down, I think this is what the question is really aimed at, is that from a budget holder point of view, it does move their position a little. Okay. Now we've already published their budget statements, and we try and lock them in as best we can. But it's the materiality, I think, it's important here, because actually we're not when we say was moved their position, it's only moved their position by a tiny amount, relatively tiny amount. It's not enough to significantly trouble the sort of context of the reported financial position. And we, with the supplementary pay file, say in that example that's gone through, we then report to NHSI on the post day one answer effectively, because we have to leave that as late as we can. But like I say, it's not once this year at a trust level have we reported two financial positions in those terms. Okay. Hopefully that was. That's a tricky question.
Thanks, Steve. We've had a couple more come in again now. So you've mentioned receipting a couple of times. Do you expect POs to be in place for all areas of non-pay?
Most areas, I think. There are one or two exceptions where it's a little tricky to guarantee that can happen. But I mean, the trust's policy is to maintain purchase orders for as absolutely as much as it possibly can, to get the visibility of the transaction and in terms of its process, how it progresses through our records. If we didn't do that, we wouldn't be able to see things coming or understand how they're transitioning. So yeah, most things.
Thank you. And got another one come in. So what day do the FM team start reviewing the ledger position, or is this a continuous ongoing process?
Yeah, so I would say, so this is the management accounts team. They would start looking from day -4. Okay. They could. Going any earlier runs the risk that they're just going to have to just keep processing and checking things. So I think they're trying to let an accumulation of transactions build effectively, enough for them to be able to begin the process of intervening. So I would say from day 4. But they need to have the foresight to be able to think about what's different about this month, what's coming up, what do I need to be aware of, So it's not as if they're doing something all the time.
Thank you. And could you give example of processes that were stopped completely?
As in terms of the things that we've culled from our transactions, I think it's more subtle than that. I think probably I'm not sure I could say we've stopped doing this altogether. I think what we've done is we've tried to assess all the transactions that were otherwise in our portfolio of adjustments, in pre-working day 1, and said to ourselves, are these all necessary? And I think what happens, and I know it'd be true of myself, is you almost get into a rhythm and a routine of working in a certain way, and you don't always think about the value of what you're doing. And it's not a criticism. I don't think it's. I think it's just habit, and it's only when you then review and study and consider that you get back to what am I actually trying to do here, and what impact is it really going to have, and you end up with you can easily see how these things start to fall away. We say just focus on the things that really matter, not to make it easier for ourselves, but really to say there's only really key things that really influence the trust's financial position. It's not the sort of minutiae of the volume of journals that you post or the technical accuracy of the position down to the sort of hundreds of pounds. Those are not the things that truly, will judge where the organisation's going. Make it not make it easier, but focus on the right things. I'm not sure if I answered that question.
I think you probably did. Gemma, did that answer your question?
Be kind, Gemma.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Great. So we haven't had any more questions come into the chat. Has anyone got any final questions? Oh, Joe, your hand's up.
I just wanted to say something to add to what both Mark and Steve have said. It's just that if people are thinking about doing this but are a little bit worried about it, I sort of go back to January when we seriously considered doing this as a team, and everybody could see all the challenges and the barriers were built. You know, what about payroll? What about, you know, the fact that we have an outsourced ledger and all these, and we could see lots of problems. But actually, once, as Steve described, once we started breaking down what those barriers were and where the challenges were, the team were just excellent at coming up with a solution and actually realizing these weren't barriers. And just to see the way they worked and the mindset changed over that 4 months to deliver working day one, and working completely different was really good to see. And I think all those barriers they built up, the way they fell away, and then the pride that the team had in actually saying, oh my God, this really took us out of our comfort zone. It really, you know, helped us move forward in terms of our thinking. A lot of what people have put in the chat box, you know, a lot of this is continuing. So we haven't just achieved a target on working day one. This is actually how we completely change our mindset around. We want to get information out of the department as quickly as possible to spend the rest of the time actually understanding what that information means. You know, and the first time we did this, we picked up, not unsurprisingly, but you know, we had payroll issues, and we immediately from day 2 started to get really underneath the skin of what was happening with our workforce costs. In the old way, we wouldn't have started that to mid-month, so it was a real example of how we were doing things differently. So I just want to say to everybody, if you're thinking about it, please just, you know, take the bull by the horns and give it a go. It's not as bad as you think it might be. And interestingly, I know now, well, for us and for Mark, when we talk to the rest of the ICS, we're reporting our position, ready to sort of move on, looking forward. And you know, 2 weeks later, the rest of the ICS are telling, sort of saying what their month end looked like, and it just feels really odd because we're now moving on into the sort of the next steps following reporting. So we really do want everybody else sort of, you know, getting on the same track as us in terms of, and others across the country in terms of working day one.